The cantina aboard the mighty battlecruiser Zephyr of Orion was a place of both relaxation and reverence. Its walls bore the battle sigils of countless campaigns, while holographic projections showcased legendary moments from the galaxy's bloodiest conflicts. For the alien soldiers stationed on the ship, it was a shrine to military glory. Warriors from a dozen different species gathered here nightly, their chitinous carapaces, fur-covered bodies, or gelatinous forms mingling in a curious harmony of camaraderie. Yet tonight the room was quieter than usual. A singular figure had taken a seat at one of the circular tables in the center of the room, his mere presence commanding attention. His name was Jace Riker, a human, a Deathworlder from the infamous planet Earth. Though he wore the same naval uniform as the rest of the crew, there was no mistaking the scars that marked him as a war veteran. His left arm, an advanced cybernetic replacement, hummed faintly as he raised a glass of amber liquid to his lips. His other arm bore long jagged scars that glimmered faintly under the low light of the cantina. His eyes, a shade of piercing steel, seemed to carry the weight of innumerable battles. The aliens whispered among themselves, glancing at Riker with awe and a hint of trepidation. Humans were rare in the Galactic Coalition, and those who had survived Earth's perilous environment and risen to prominence in military ranks were rarer still. The legends surrounding their homeworld, a place rife with predators, unstable climates, and dangerous ecosystems, had given rise to tales of near-supernatural resilience. "Why do they call Earth a death world anyway?" whispered Klikta, a crustacean-like Zelnath soldier with shimmering exoskeletal plates. "Because it's insane," muttered Zinnia, a reptilian Karvak. Her voice slithered with a mix of fascination and unease. "Gravity nearly twice the galactic standard. Apex predators everywhere. Diseases that can kill you before you even know you're sick. And those humans, they evolved there. They thrived there." Across the room, a hulking Ursidran soldier, a bear-like species nearly twice the size of a human, leaned over his drink. "You think he's as dangerous as they say?" "Oh, he's worse," Zinnia replied, her golden eyes narrowing. "They say Jace Riker took out an entire pirate crew single-handedly. And he didn't even use a plasma rifle. He used a primitive weapon from Earth." "Oh, what's it called?" "A knife." The murmurs grew louder, drawing Riker's attention. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. He'd heard every kind of rumor about himself, from absurd fabrications to terrifying truths. And while he didn't particularly enjoy the spotlight, he knew how to wield it when necessary. With a casual motion, he stood and raised his glass. "You've been whispering all night," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. It was smooth, calm, but with an undeniable edge that silenced the crowd instantly. "If you've got questions, ask them. I won't bite." A brief silence followed, until Klikta's claws clicked nervously against the table. "Is it true?" the Zelnath asked, his voice hesitant. "About Earth? That it's as dangerous as they say?" Riker chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent shivers through the room. "Dangerous? That's putting it lightly. Earth doesn't just want to kill you, it thrives on it. Let me tell you a story." The soldiers leaned in, their various appendages, ears and sensory organs focused entirely on the human. Even the cantina's ambient hum seemed to quiet as Riker began his tale. ####, the predator of the depths. "When I was a kid, maybe 12 years old, my dad took me on a fishing trip," Riker began, his voice steady but filled with a subtle intensity that drew everyone in. "We went out to this place called the Atlantic Ocean. It's one of Earth's largest bodies of water, covers about 20% of the planet's surface. Beautiful place, but don't let that fool you. The ocean's one of the most unforgiving environments you'll ever encounter." Klikta tilted his head, his mandibles clicking in confusion. "Water? Dangerous?" Riker grinned. "You'd think not, wouldn't you? But on Earth, water hides predators so old and so deadly, they make most of the galaxy's apex species look like amateurs. We were out in the middle of this vast, endless expanse of blue. No land in sight. Just waves, wind, and the occasional cry of a seabird. My dad handed me a fishing rod, a primitive tool by your standards, just a long pole with a line and a hook at the end, and told me to cast it out into the water." The aliens listened with rapt attention, picturing this strange ritual. Zinnia's tail flicked nervously. "And then?" Riker leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "And then I felt a tug. Not a little nibble, mind you. This was force. Whatever was on the other end of that line wasn't just fighting, I swear it was trying to drag me into the depths. My dad just laughed and told me to hold on tight. He said, 'That's a big one, son. Don't let it get away.'" The Ursidran soldier growled softly, his voice a rumble of approval. Sounds like a worthy challenge. Oh, it was, Riker replied. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. After what felt like hours of fighting this thing, it finally broke the surface. And that's when I saw it, a great white shark. 15 feet of muscle, teeth, and pure instinct. Eyes black as night, jaws wide enough to snap me in half, and a body built to slice through the water like a plasma blade. The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Even the Ursidran looked impressed. Wait, Zinnia interjected, her voice skeptical. You're telling me this shark was just there? In the water? Hundreds of them, Riker confirmed. Thousands maybe. The oceans are full of predators like that. Some even bigger. My dad and I were lucky we weren't in the water ourselves. Sharks aren't the kind to pass up a free meal. Klikta shuddered, his exoskeleton clinking faintly. And what happened? Did it attack? Riker shook his head. Not exactly. The shark fought like hell, thrashing and twisting, trying to break free of the line. My dad told me to let it go, said there was no way we could reel in something that big without capsizing the boat. But I was a stubborn kid. I wanted to prove I could handle it. The human paused, letting the tension build. The silence was electric. So I held on, he continued. And for a moment it seemed like I might actually win. But then out of nowhere the shark jerked sideways and the line snapped. I fell back into the boat and my dad just laughed, saying, "Lesson learned, son. There's always a bigger fish." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The idea of a world teeming with creatures that could overpower a human, one of the most feared species in the galaxy, was both fascinating and terrifying. That was just a shark, Riker added, his voice low but resonant. One predator in a sea full of them. You've heard of apex predators in other ecosystems, wolves, lions, raptors. Earth has them all. And here's the kicker, they're not even the deadliest thing on the planet. That title belongs to the tiniest killers. Klikta's mandibles twitched. Tiniest killers? Viruses, Riker said, leaning back in his chair. Microscopic organisms so small you can't see them without special equipment. They don't have teeth or claws, but they'll kill you just as dead. They invade your body, hijack your cells, and turn them into factories for more viruses. Some of Earth's most infamous plagues wiped out millions. Entire civilizations brought to their knees by something you couldn't even see. The cantina fell silent again. For a moment, no one dared to speak. Finally, Zinnia broke the silence. You survived all of that? Predators, viruses, everything? Riker's grin returned, sharp and full of purpose. Survived? We thrived. That's what makes humans dangerous. We don't just endure adversity, we adapt to it. And that's why you're lucky we're on the same side. The room erupted in a mixture of nervous laughter and scattered applause. The aliens had come seeking stories and Jace Riker had delivered. Yet as the human sat back down, nursing his drink, a glint in his eye suggested that this was only the beginning. After all, Earth had far more horrors to share. The cantina's energy shifted. The alien soldiers who had been quietly sizing Jace Riker up now leaned forward in rapt attention. The humans' reputation as Deathworlders had always been a distant, abstract concept. But hearing tales of Earth directly from one of its survivors made it chillingly real. Riker swirled his drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light. He let the room hang in silence for a moment longer before raising his gaze to the crowd. That was just the ocean, he said, his voice calm but laced with an almost predatory edge. Now, let me tell you about the forests. Klikta, still reeling from the tail of the shark, clicked nervously. The forests? What could be more dangerous than those oceans you described? Riker raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. You'd be surprised. The forests of Earth aren't just places of beauty and tranquility, they're battlegrounds, where survival is a constant fight against creatures, the elements, and even the plants themselves. Plants? Zinnia interjected, her golden eyes narrowing. Surely you're exaggerating? Riker chuckled, shaking his head. I wish I were. But I'll get to that. First, let me set the scene. He leaned forward, placing his cybernetic hand on the table. The metal fingers clicked softly against the surface, as if punctuating his words. When I was about 16, Riker began, I spent a summer working in a place called the Amazon rainforest. It's one of Earth's largest and most diverse ecosystems. A massive jungle that stretches for millions of square kilometers. Scientists call it the lungs of the planet because it produces so much oxygen. But to those who've been there, it's something else entirely. A green hell. The alien soldiers listened intently, their imaginations painting a picture of this vast alien jungle. The moment you step into the Amazon, Riker continued, you feel it. The humidity wraps around you like a second skin, thick and stifling. Every breath tastes like damp earth and decay. The trees form a canopy so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. It's dark, wet, and alive. Everything there is trying to eat, sting, or poison you. Clickta tilted his head, his antennae twitching. What kinds of creatures live in this Amazon? Riker's smirk widened. Where do I even begin? Let's start small. There are ants, tiny insects barely the size of your claw. But don't let their size fool you. Some of them, like the bullet ant, deliver a sting so painful it's been compared to being shot with a plasma bolt. And that's just the ants. You've also got spiders, snakes, and frogs, all carrying venom potent enough to kill something 10 times their size. The Ursidran soldier growled softly, his fur bristling. What kind of snakes? Plenty, Riker said. But the one you don't want to meet is the green anaconda. Picture this, a snake that can grow up to 30 feet long and weigh over 500 pounds. It doesn't kill with venom, it constricts. Wraps itself around you and squeezes until your bones break and your lungs collapse. Zinnia shuddered, her tail curling around her chair. And you worked there? As a teenager? Worked, survived, thrived, Riker replied, his tone matter-of-fact. But the animals weren't the only dangers. The plants were just as bad if not worse. ### nature's ambush. There was this one day, Riker said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing his audience closer. I was hiking with a small research team collecting samples. It was raining, hard enough that the trail turned into mud. We came across this patch of ground covered in lush, green vines. Looked harmless enough, but I'd read enough field guides to recognize the trap. Trap? Clickta asked, his mandibles clicking nervously. Riker nodded. Strangler figure. It's a parasitic plant. Starts as a vine, wrapping itself around a host tree. Slowly, over years, it tightens its grip, cutting off the tree's nutrients and killing it. By the time it's done, the host tree is dead, and the fig is standing tall, using the hollowed-out corpse as its foundation. The room fell silent, the aliens visibly unnerved. That's just one example, Riker continued. There's also the manchineel tree. Its fruit looks like tiny green apples, but they're deadly. One bite and you'll be in agony as its toxins burn through your stomach. Even standing under the tree in the rain is dangerous. Its sap mixes with the water and burns your skin like acid. Zinnia hissed softly, her reptilian features contorted in disbelief. Your planet is insane. Riker laughed. You're not wrong. But here's the thing, humans learned to adapt. We didn't just survive the Amazon. We turned it into a proving ground. We learned to identify the dangers, to navigate its labyrinth of life and death. And for those who couldn't? Well, let's just say the jungle doesn't forgive mistakes. ### nightfall in the jungle. The scariest part of the rainforest, Riker said, his tone growing darker, is the night. The cantina's ambient hum seemed to fade as he spoke, the tension in the room growing palpable. When the sun goes down, the jungle comes alive. The air fills with the sounds of insects, frogs, and predators on the hunt. Your vision is useless, it's too dark to see anything. You rely on sound, and even that betrays you. Everything echoes, masking the true distance of whatever's out there. Clickta's claws tapped nervously against the table. What did you do? You stay alert, Riker replied. And you pray that whatever's out there isn't hungry. One night, I was with the research team camping near a river. We had a fire going, primitive but effective. It keeps most predators away. But not all. He paused, letting the suspense build. That night we heard something. A low, rumbling growl coming from the trees. At first we thought it was a jaguar, big cat, apex predator capable of dragging prey 3 times its size up a tree. But the sound was wrong. It was deeper, more guttural. Then we saw it, 2 glowing eyes reflecting the firelight, staring at us from the darkness. The soldiers leaned forward, their breaths held. Turned out to be a black caiman, Riker said, his voice steady but grim. A massive reptile, essentially Earth's version of your Galactic Coalition crocodile. It must have been over 15 feet long. It didn't care about the fire. It just stared, waiting for one of us to get close to the water. What did you do? Zinnia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We held our ground, Riker said. Humans might not be the strongest species, but we know how to fight smart. We used the fire to create a barrier, threw torches to scare it off. Eventually, it slithered back into the river. But I'll never forget those eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly merciless. ### lessons from the jungle. Riker leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The jungle taught me something important," he said. "Survival isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being adaptable. It's about knowing when to fight and when to run. And above all, it's about respecting the world around you. Because on Earth, if you don't respect it, it'll kill you." The cantina was silent for a long moment, the alien soldiers processing what they just heard. For them, the idea of a world so hostile, yet so vibrant, was almost incomprehensible. Finally, the Ursidran soldier broke the silence. "Your planet," he rumbled, "is a testament to your species' strength. I understand now why humans are so feared and respected." Riker raised his glass, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Here's to Earth," he said. "The deadliest teacher I ever had." The soldiers raised their own glasses in a toast, the air thick with newfound respect and camaraderie. As Riker took another sip, he glanced around the room, already preparing his next tale. After all, the jungles of Earth were just one chapter in a much larger story. The cantina aboard the Zephyr of Orion had fallen into a heavy silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of the ship's engines. Jace Riker's tales of Earth had shaken the alien soldiers to their cores. They'd seen combat on distant planets, fought against hostile species, and endured unimaginable hardships. But the stories of Earth painted a picture of a world so unrelenting, so merciless, that it defied their understanding of survival. The Ursidran soldier finally spoke, his voice a deep rumble that reverberated through the room. "The oceans and jungles of your world are terrifying enough. But what of the mountains? Surely those are less dangerous?" Riker chuckled, shaking his head. "You'd think so, wouldn't you? Mountains are beautiful, majestic, symbols of endurance and resilience. But on Earth they're just as deadly as any ocean or jungle. Sometimes more." The alien soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. For most of them, mountains were serene places, barren but peaceful. The idea that Earth's mountains could be just as hostile as its predators or venomous plants was difficult to fathom. Riker took a long sip from his drink before setting it down. "Let me tell you about the time I climbed Mount Everest. ###the roof of the world. Mount Everest," Riker began, his tone taking on a reverent edge, "is the tallest mountain on Earth. It stands over 8,800 meters above sea level, a peak so high it pierces the clouds. Humans call it the roof of the world. But don't let the name fool you. It's no place for kings or gods. It's a place where the planet itself will try to kill you." Zinnia's tail flicked nervously. "How can a mountain kill you?" "Let me explain," Riker said. "The higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. There's less oxygen to breathe and your body starts to shut down. We call it the death zone, anywhere above 8,000 meters. Spend too much time there and you'll suffocate even if you're standing perfectly still." Clickta's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "Surely you had technology to compensate? Breathing apparatuses, pressurized suits?" "We did," Riker confirmed. "Oxygen tanks, insulated gear, the best equipment money could buy. But even that only gives you a fighting chance. The cold up there is so intense that your skin can freeze solid in minutes. The winds howl at over 100 kilometers per hour, strong enough to knock you off the mountain. And then there are the avalanches, entire walls of ice and snow collapsing without warning, burying everything in their path." The Ursidran grunted, his fur bristling. "Why would anyone willingly climb such a place?" Riker's expression softened. "Because it's there," he said simply. "Humans have this insatiable need to push boundaries, to see what lies beyond the horizon. For some, climbing Everest isn't about conquering the mountain, it's about conquering yourself." ###the deadliest climb. "When I climbed Everest," Riker continued, "I was part of a small expedition team. There were 6 of us, seasoned climbers each with years of experience. We spent weeks acclimatizing to the altitude, hiking through treacherous passes, and sleeping in camps perched on narrow ledges. But no amount of preparation could truly prepare you for the final ascent." The aliens leaned in, their various appendages twitching with anticipation. "It was night when we made our summit push," Riker said. "You climb at night because the snow is more stable when it's frozen. But that also means you're navigating in near total darkness, with nothing but a headlamp to guide you. The air was so thin that every step felt like lifting a boulder. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, and the cold bit through every layer of clothing." He paused, his gaze distant as he relived the memory. "At about 8,500 meters we reached the Hillary Step, a nearly vertical rock face just below the summit. It's one of the most dangerous sections of the climb. As I was climbing I heard a sound, a low rumbling crack that made my blood run cold. An avalanche was coming. The room collectively tensed, the alien soldiers hanging on Riker's every word. "We barely had time to react," Riker said. The snow roared down the mountain, sweeping away everything in its path. I clung to the rock face, my ice axe buried as deep as I could manage. When it was over, 2 of my teammates were gone. Just like that. Klikta's antennae drooped. "You lost them?" Riker nodded grimly. "That's the reality of climbing Everest. The mountain takes what it wants." We pressed on though. Reaching the summit felt hollow after what we'd lost. But there's no time to mourn up there. The descent is even more dangerous. Most climbers who die on Everest don't die on the way up. They die trying to get back down. ####the ghosts of Everest. As Riker spoke, his voice took on a haunted quality that sent shivers through the room. "Everest is littered with the bodies of those who didn't make it," he said. "Frozen in place, preserved by the cold. They're markers now, grim reminders of what can happen if you make even one mistake. Some have been there for decades, their brightly colored climbing suits still visible against the snow." Zinnia hissed softly, her golden eyes wide with horror. "And you saw them?" Riker nodded. "You can't avoid them. There's a spot near the summit called Rainbow Valley. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? But the name comes from the bodies, climbers wearing bright jackets, scattered across the slopes like fallen stars." The cantina fell silent, the weight of Riker's words pressing down on everyone. "Coming down was the hardest part," Riker said, his voice quieter now. "The oxygen tanks were running low and my body was shutting down. Frostbite had set in, I lost 2 toes to it. But we made it somehow. The mountain didn't claim me that day." The Ursidran growled softly, his massive frame leaning forward. "You climbed to the top of the world and lived to tell the tale. That's more than most could say." Riker shrugged, though there was a hint of pride in his expression. "Surviving Everest isn't about strength. It's about persistence. You keep moving one step at a time even when every part of you is screaming to stop. That's the human way." As the aliens processed Riker's story, the tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just fear they felt anymore, it was respect. The mountains of Earth weren't just challenges to be overcome. They were reflections of humanity's indomitable spirit. Klikta, his claws tapping thoughtfully against the table, finally broke the silence. "Your planet is relentless, Riker. It pushes its inhabitants to their limits at every turn. And yet, you endure." Riker smiled faintly. "Endurance is what we're built for. Earth doesn't give you a choice. You either adapt or you die. And if you're lucky enough to survive, you come out stronger." The Ursidran raised his drink in a toast. "To Earth," he said, his deep voice resonating through the cantina. "And to the humans who thrive there." The rest of the soldiers followed suit, their glasses raised high. Riker clinked his glass against the Ursidran's, a knowing look in his steel-gray eyes. "To Earth," he echoed. "The deadliest training ground in the galaxy." As the soldiers drank, the atmosphere shifted once more. They weren't just listening to tales anymore, they were beginning to understand. Earth wasn't just a death world. It was a crucible and humans were the steel it forged. But Riker wasn't finished. There were still more stories too. The cantina aboard the Zephyr of Orion was hushed, the tension thick as Jace Riker leaned back in his chair. His stories had unraveled a tapestry of horrors, oceans teeming with predators, jungles that consumed the unwary, and mountains that demanded a price for every step. Yet, the glint in his eye hinted there was one final tale to tell, one that would tie it all together. "You've heard about the oceans, the jungles, and the mountains," Riker began, his voice calm but commanding. "But there's one thing that unites them all. One force that doesn't care whether you're in the water, on land, or in the sky. And that force is the weather." Klikta tilted his head, his antennae twitching. "The weather? Surely that's not as dangerous as—" "Don't underestimate it," Riker interrupted, his tone sharp. "On Earth, weather isn't just a backdrop, it's a battlefield. And if you don't respect it, you won't survive long enough to regret it." He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch. The alien soldiers leaned in, their curiosity outweighing their unease. ###A storm without mercy. "I was 24, Riker began, his voice low and steady, serving in the Terran Armed Forces. My unit was deployed to a region called Tornado Alley, a stretch of land on Earth where the atmosphere churns with such ferocity that it spawns hundreds of tornadoes every year. These aren't just winds, they're spinning towers of destruction, capable of tearing apart buildings, flipping tanks, and hurling debris like shrapnel." Zinnia's golden eyes widened. "You were sent into such a place intentionally?" Riker smirked. "It wasn't by choice. A freak storm had formed faster than the meteorologists could predict, cutting off several towns. Civilians were trapped and we were sent in to evacuate them. What we didn't know was that this storm was unlike anything Earth had seen in decades. He paused, his gaze distant. It was a supercell. The kind of storm that seems alive, hunting everything in its path. The skies turned an unnatural shade of green, and the air was so charged with electricity that our radios crackled with static. Then came the hail, chunks of ice the size of your head, smashing down with enough force to dent armored vehicles. And that was just the beginning. #### the eye of chaos. We were halfway through the evacuation, Riker continued, when the sirens started wailing. That's how we warn people about tornadoes, a deep, haunting sound that chills you to the bone. I'll never forget the sight of that funnel cloud forming in the distance, twisting and growing as it roared toward us. Clickta's mandibles clicked nervously. What did you do? We did what humans always do, Riker said. We adapted. We loaded as many civilians as we could into our transports and headed for the nearest shelter. But the storm was faster. It overtook us, slamming into our convoy with winds over 300 kilometers per hour. Vehicles were tossed like toys, power lines snapped, and the air was filled with debris, splinters of wood, shards of glass, even entire trees. The Ursidran soldier growled softly, his fur bristling. How did you survive that? Riker's cybernetic hand clenched into a fist, the metal fingers creaking. Barely. My transport was flipped, the impact knocking me unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in a field, surrounded by the wreckage of the convoy. The storm was still raging, but I could hear screams in the distance. Civilians. My team. They were trapped and I couldn't leave them. #### defying the storm. Riker's voice grew quieter, more somber. I ran toward the screams, pushing through winds that felt like they'd ripped the flesh off my bones. The air was thick with dirt and rain, making it nearly impossible to see. I found a mother and her 2 kids huddled behind what was left of a vehicle. They were terrified, clinging to each other as the storm howled around them. He paused, his jaw tightening. I got them to safety, a drainage ditch where the winds couldn't reach us. But as I turned back to look for more survivors, I saw it. The tornado. It was massive, over a kilometer wide, and it was coming straight for us. Zinnia's tail curled tightly around her chair. What did you do? Riker smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. What I always do. I fought. I grabbed those kids, held them as tightly as I could, and threw myself over them. The tornado passed right over us, the roar so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. Debris slammed into my back, tearing through my armor. But when it was over, we were still alive. The cantina fell silent, the weight of Riker's words hanging heavy in the air. #### Earth's legacy. Riker leaned back, his expression unreadable. That storm took everything, our vehicles, our supplies, even some of my teammates. But it didn't break us. We completed the evacuation, got those civilians to safety. And when the skies finally cleared, I looked out at the devastation and realized something. He met the eyes of each alien soldier in turn, his gaze piercing. Earth isn't just a death world. It's a forge. It doesn't just kill, it shapes you, hardens you, teaches you what it means to fight, to endure, to survive. And that's why humans are the way we are. Because no matter where we go, no matter what we face, we carry Earth with us. Clickta, his mandibles trembling, finally spoke. Your stories, they are beyond comprehension. Your planet, your people, you are unlike anything in the galaxy. Riker chuckled softly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. We're not so different, Clickta. Every species has its challenges, its crucibles. Ours just happens to be a little intense. The Ursidran raised his glass once more. To Earth, he rumbled. And to those forged in its fire. The others joined the toast, their respect for Riker and his species evident in their eyes. As the cantina returned to its usual hum of conversation, Riker leaned back, a satisfied look on his face. He'd given them a glimpse of what it meant to be human, to hail from a world where survival wasn't guaranteed but earned. And in doing so, he'd reminded himself of the strength that Earth had instilled in him. Because no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many battles he fought, Jace Riker would always be a son of Earth, a survivor of the galaxy's deadliest training ground.